to introduce the law of demand, distinguish between a change in the quantity demanded for a good and a change in demand for that good, and outline some of the determinants of demand that can cause the demand for a good to increase or decrease. This lesson builds on the concepts introduced in our opening unit in the economics course, in which we introduced the idea of the market system as a way for society to allocate its scarce resources between competing wants and needs. We learned in one of our recent lessons that a market is a place where buyers and sellers meet to engage in exchanges of goods, services, or resources. Today we're going to be focusing specifically on a product market. In fact, we're going to be looking at the market for a particular good, that for candy. You learned earlier on that every market involves buyers and sellers. Today we're going to be looking at the perspective of the buyers, those who demand a particular good. The buyers of goods demand that good. We have to define demand and explain the relationship between a good's price and the demand for that good. To introduce the concept of demand to my own students, I recently gave them a survey asking them how much of their favorite candy in the world they would buy at a range of prices in a week. Every one of my students responded to the survey you see here. First, I asked them what their favorite candy was, and then I asked them how many units or pieces of their favorite candy would they buy at prices ranging from $2.50 to 50 cents. Let's look at some of the results of that survey. I ended up having about 68 students complete the survey, and you can see their answers here. In the column on the right, you can see their favorite candies, and at the top we see the different price options from $2.50 down to 50 cents. Let's study the results here. Notice that at a price of $2.50, my 68 students would buy a total of 173 units of their favorite candies in a week. As the price falls from $2.50 to 50 cents, we see that the quantity that my students would be willing and able to buy increases up to around 500 pieces of candy each week between the 68 of them. As you can see here in the blue table, I've put the results into a table. What we actually have here is what's called a demand schedule. The table shows us how, as the price of candy increases, the quantity demanded among my 68 students falls. That's significant, but that's not the best way to visualize the demand for candy among my 68 students in a week. Let's have a look at another way to represent the demand for candy. What we have here is actually a demand curve. In economics, we love graphs, we love models, we love to be able to visualize basic economic concepts in ways that make them easy to understand. And this is a very easy way to represent the total demand for candy among my 68 students in a week at a range of prices from 50 cents up to $2.50. Notice the vertical axis is labeled price and the horizontal axis is labeled quantity demanded. As the price of candy falls from 2.5 to 2, the quantity demanded increases, and so on as the price falls to 1.5 down to 1 down to 0.5 or half a dollar per candy. The line going through the dark blue demand curve is the line of best fit. In a later lesson, we might calculate the equation for that line, which would give us the demand equation, but today I just want to focus on the relationship that we see here. Notice that the relationship between the price of candy and the quantity of candy demanded among my students is inverse. That's very important. That is something that is so universally true that we actually call that the law of demand. So let's go over here and we're going to take some notes. The law of demand tells us that, assuming nothing else changes, a decrease in the price of a good will cause the quantity demanded to increase, and vice versa. In other words, if price increases, quantity demanded decreases. The relationship demonstrated among my own students in their demand for candy demonstrates this inverse relationship very clearly. At higher prices, my students demand lower quantities of candy. At lower prices, they demand higher quantities of candy. Let's go back to our definition of the law of demand, and we need to highlight some very important parts of this definition. When I say all else equal, there's actually a Latin expression that economists like to use for this, and that is ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus is an assumption in economics that we always make when looking at how a change in one variable will cause a change in another variable. So ceteris paribus is our assumption here. Whenever the price of a good changes, the quantity demanded changes inversely to the price. This inverse relationship is so universally observed among the different goods and services that society has to choose from that it is actually known as the law of demand because it is inviolable. Laws are obeyed in nearly every circumstance imaginable. And we're going to assume going forward in this class that this law will always be followed in the market for different goods. At high prices, consumers will demand lower quantities, and at low prices, consumers will demand higher quantities. We can plot this relationship on a standard demand diagram, which I'm going to do now. First, our graph needs some labels. I'm going to put on the vertical axis the price. The price is what we call the independent variable in our demand diagram. As the price of a good changes, the quantity demanded is dependent on the price. So the quantity demanded, or QD, will be my horizontal axis label. We don't need values on this graph because the purpose is not to look specifically at the demand for candy, but more generally in the relationship between the price of candy and the quantity demanded. And that relationship is inverse. At higher prices, there is a lower quantity demanded, so I can indicate here. You can see that at high prices, there's less candy demanded, and at low prices, there's a greater quantity of the good demanded. The line itself is a visual representation of the demand for candy. So I'll put a title at the top of my graph. We can see very easily and clearly that as price decreases, so a decrease in price, the quantity demanded increases. Why is this? Why are people willing to buy more of a good as the price of that good falls? Let's take some notes over here to explain why there is an inverse relationship between a good's price and its quantity demanded. There's a couple of explanations for the law of demand. As a good's price falls, consumers feel that their real income is increasing. This is known as the income effect. Lower prices leave us with greater purchasing power. As we have greater purchasing power, we tend to demand more of particular goods. In the case of candy, a fall in the price of candy from $2.50 to 50 cents makes my students who may have fixed allowances or incomes feel a little bit richer. Therefore, as they feel richer, they think they can buy more candy. The income effect is one explanation for the law of demand. Another explanation is what we call the substitution effect. As the price of a particular good falls, potential substitutes for that good appear more expensive. So we tend to consume less of the substitutes, in other words, the goods that we might have consumed besides the good in question, and more of the good whose price is falling. An example of this might be other treats that students might buy besides candy. So if the price of candy falls, students may substitute candy instead of other goods like cookies or ice cream and other treats that they might have enjoyed instead of candy. As the price of one good falls, people tend to substitute more of that good into their consumption because the other goods that they might have consumed appear more expensive. This explanation for the law of demand is known as the substitution effect. A third explanation that economists like to use when explaining the relationship between a good's price and the quantity demanded is the idea that as individuals consume more of a good, they enjoy additional units of that good less and less. This is what we call diminishing marginal utility. Because we get less utility or happiness out of additional units of a good as we consume more of it, we are willing to pay less and less for it. So we can say, therefore, consumers are only willing to buy more of a good if its price falls. We can see that relationship quite clearly in our demand for candy here. At higher prices, consumers are willing to buy less of a good because they get a lot of marginal utility out of the first few pieces of candy. Personally, my favorite candy is Butterfingers. If Butterfingers were selling for $2.50 a piece, I'd probably only buy one per week because I truly value that first Butterfinger at more than $2.50. But a second Butterfinger I will not value at $2.50. Therefore, I would not be willing to buy more than one Butterfinger unless they were selling for less than $2.50. However, at a price of 50 cents, I would probably buy 4 or 5 Butterfingers in a week because the additional benefit or utility I get from the third, fourth, or fifth Butterfinger is less than the original $2.50 I was being asked to pay. However, at a price of 50 cents, I certainly get more than 50 cents of benefit out of a fourth Butterfinger. Diminishing marginal utility helps explain why consumers will buy more of a good as the price falls. It's because we get less benefit out of additional units of a good, therefore we're only willing to buy more of it as the price decreases. These three economic concepts, the income effect, the substitution effect, and diminishing marginal utility, help explain the inverse relationship between a good's price and the quantity that consumers are willing and able to buy in a particular period of time. This relationship is encapsulated in both the demand schedule or table, which we saw here in the results from my survey among my students, and a demand curve, which we see here, which plots that relationship between a good's price and quantity demanded. Demand can always be illustrated as a curve, like we see in this graph on the right. As the price of the good is high, the quantity consumers are willing and able to buy is low. As the price of the good is low, the quantity consumers are willing and able to buy increases. In our next lesson, we're going to distinguish between a change in the quantity demanded for a good and a change in the good's demand. And we'll also outline some of the determinants of demand that can cause an entire demand curve to shift inwards or outwards.
Here we go.